Hi, my name is Isabella Wilhelm, and I'm here today with Melissa Roscoe, Emily Paredes, and Mara Villalobos presenting on imprisonment during the French Revolution and prison typology. By the end of the 18th century, France's involvement with the Americans caused the country with its financial stability. This left the country with poor harvests, diseases, inflation, and high taxes. The middle and lower class were summoned towards the monarchy and later rebelled against it. They demanded for fair rates instead of giving the rights exclusively to the high and wealthy upper class. They insisted that freedom should be for all instead of for them. However, far from freedom, the French only experienced incarceration, torture, and solitary confinement. France's prison typology began to be rather invasive than creating architecture that was built for prisons. They kind of invaded existing structures and adapted the architecture to the needs of the revolution through a military standpoint. Where architecture was meant to heal, aid, relieve, it became a pivot for punishment, incapacitation, and confinement, turning hospitals, infirmaries, forts, and others into prisons. These ideals became so efficient for the monarchy that the idea of a building meant to confine criminals later traveled to the United States, where these principles became a reformatory for the first true penitentiaries. In the next slides, we're going to visit some case studies that further talk about these ideals and how they were conveyed through architecture. Our first case study is the Bagne of Toulon. After the revolution, there was a clear dividing line between the ancient regime in France, which constituted under the detention and deprivation of liberty, and the modern regime, which aimed to improve those conditions and make it a reform where prisoners could be introduced back into society. The Bagne of Toulon emerged from this idea. After the war, King Louis XIII decided to transfer military back into Toulon, and this is when Toulon became a port of war and home of the royal galleys. Here, prisoners from the war would inhabit floating prisons until the Bagne of Toulon was built due to the increase in capacity and increase in population. The Bagne of Toulon consisted of a hospital, administrative offices, factories, couriers, and a chapel. And this is one of the master plans that we were able to find. It was known to be very highly abusive, and prisoners would be forced to do very harsh labor. They would be chained to iron balls and kept away from the public. Work was divided between the grand fatigue and the petite fatigue, where the grand fatigue corresponded to be forced and heavy labor, while the petite constituted working in hospitals, kitchens, and very moderate labor. During its final years of the revolution, it was used by royalists from the revolting working class as prisoners. It became for them a low security open prison where it allowed them to come in and out freely. The prisoners, the real prisoners, were kept away in a separate department. This is a floor plan and its different programs that I mentioned earlier. The prison side was very open, as in these images, and they were meant to invite ports in. The architecture was very secluded and enclosed. The dungeons were narrow, and it had very small windows throughout. Today, there's no virtually trace of it, but by 1944, the Bagne of Toulon was almost entirely wiped out due to attacks in World War II. The Bastille was built initially as a fort to protect Saint Antoine from the Hundred Years' War, and it played a significant role in the conflict between the English and the French. The Bastille was built as a symbol of strength and power, creating a strong fort that could withstand English attacks. It was occasionally used to hold prisoners, but it would not hold more than 9. It was initially used as a prison for the upper class, since the king would imprison those in here who angered him or opposed him. As a prison, it consisted of a chapel, 2 courtyards, a royal offices with interrogation rooms, a library, and a servant quarter. which conveyed the matter of high class of the prison. The kitchen and baths were outside of the main gate, and each of the towers held calots in the roofs and dungeons within the foundation. Here is a section of the Bastille Fortress, which conveys its strength and power. Here are some internal pictures of the Bastille. The cells were mainly located in the dungeons, and the structure of the building aimed to reveal and confine. It revealed how powerful it was, but it would raise questions of what will happen behind closed doors. Here are some internal pictures of the dungeons, and our next case study is the Saint-Lazare prison, which was founded as a leper colony in the late 12th century, where people with leprosy would be isolated. It was then given to a Catholic priest for it to become a missionary center that will house those unwanted by society. It was then the first target for the attacking Bastille, which initiated the Reign of Terror, and during this time, the building was converted into a prison where it served as a penitentiary to mass incarcerate and torture prisoners. Later on, it was turned into a women's prison in the 19th century. The prison held many delinquent women, such as prostitutes, thieves, and convicts, to serve prison work as well as go through rehabilitation. The architectural design of the prison, a courtyard form, was divided into two sections with the purpose of separating and preventing encounter between the ones awaiting to trial and those who were convicted. The prison had several programs that the women prisoners shared, such as workrooms, an infirmary, refectory, and a chapel, but the separated rooms of prisoners remained restricted from each other. The only surviving remains of the prison are the infirmary and the chapel. On November 2005, both buildings were given a landmark status of historic monuments. These are some pictures of the facades and the exterior moments. And you can see the courtyard through here. Some other interior moments that convey the interior programs, such as the dormitory, workroom, the refectory, and the cohort. We can see the clear Catholic influence that the prison had. Later on, it was finally demolished after decades, with only the chapel and infirmary surviving, as I said earlier. Our fourth case study is the Eastern State Penitentiary. During the 18th century, many Frenchmen had been in America and brought with them their ideals, more specifically, their prison ideals. The French wanted to change the prison reform, which led to a new ideal that stated that the punishment would be determined by the crime. This sparked the American thought on prisons, having the first serious attempt at prison reform in America launched in Philadelphia. French modeled the first prison to open in the United States was the Eastern State Penitentiary. It was modeled after how French used their prisons to punish, rehab, or isolate, and its programs only pushed the solitary confinement and can be compared to the Panopticon's docile individual modeling concept. The prison was a responsive. This prison was a response to the American Revolution, and it began as a movement to change the prisoners' behaviors through solitary confinement to make them regretful of their actions. The architect of this building was John Haviland, and he designed this building to consist of cell blocks extending outwards from the central surveillance area, which is in the core. This prison was modeled as a wheel with 7 cell blocks, like pictured above, that would then radiate from the core. Each cell block had an adjacent outdoor exercise yard enclosed by a 10-foot wall, and the cells had their own water system, central system, heating, toilets, and skylights, and personal elements, and this was used to reinforce that solitary confinement. And here you can see a section of how one of the wings extends from the central core. In the cells, it will have one skylight that reflected the idea of a prisoner being able to have freedom, but never being able to attain it. And this, again, was to further convey the idea of confinement. Because of this concept, the Eastern Penitentiary State was one of the most notable, rational, and most romantic creation of its time, but it closed its doors on 1971 because it was neglected, and it's now a historic museum. Our last and final case study is the New Jersey State Prison. After closing the Eastern military isolation cages, a new reform emerged from America as a response to the cruel and inhumane measures that the other prisons took that emerged from the French Revolution. New Jersey State prison system emerged after the model of the Soledad prison in California and was modeled to house the inmates that had not broken any institutional rules but posed a threat to the prison administrations. Thus, these prisons were isolated from the rest and taken to management control unit where they aim to reshape their convictions by subjecting them to striking level physical control and sensory deprivation. It was also modeled after the surveillance, kind of like the previous case study, with wings extending out of it. It was also the first prison in the United States to inhabit elements of Egyptian revival architecture. Here is one of the floor plans that, as I said, conveyed that central power system. Exterior moments. Finally, Haviland designed this reform with three main spaces that were separated but also interconnected with physical plans, which consisted of the penitentiary house, the fortress, and the prison facility. The system aimed to keep inmates separated by crime, but also to use correctional measures according to the crime committed. And to today's date, this prison is still active. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and hope you enjoyed it.